50 years after Enoch Powell's infamous speech, the British establishment has gone into something of a victorious frenzy as politicians and journalists line up to gloat and crow about how manifestly wrong he was with regard to the dangers of mass immigration to this small island. But in this new era of apparent fake news everywhere we look, is this orgiastic public annihilation of Mr. Powell's prophecies not fake news itself? Two of his statements certainly suggest this is the case. The first is the opening sentence of his speech where he said, quote, "The supreme function of statesmanship is to provide against preventable evils," end quote, which rather brings to mind our government's perverse desire to willingly allow known jihadis to return to Britain. The second, and of course his most disgraceful, was to suggest that the black man would soon come to have the whip hand over the white man. And Powell was some years out in his time frame for this, just as he was about the wielder of said whip. The West Indians he alluded to were at that time respectable and integrated by and large, which is sadly no longer the case when it comes to varied non-English ethnic minorities in general and Islam in particular. It would take a particularly deluded type of progressive liberal to argue sections of our newly imported peoples and cultures do not exert considerable power over the native population and are only able to do so because they scare the living daylights out of our political class. Only a few weeks ago, police officers refused to halt a succession of public Islamic prayers in Hyde Park, despite said prayers contravening park bylaws. The police were fully aware a confrontational situation would quickly develop if they upheld the law, so they bravely did not. Now, I don't want to polarize this into an Islamic black-white issue, so we'll merely say this is one example of non-English people wielding the whip hand over the English. Young vulnerable English girls in their thousands were raped and abused by British Muslims for decades. It hasn't stopped. While our politicians, police, journalists, local councillors and social workers turned a blind eye lest they be accused of the greatest crime of the 21st century, racism. The Muslim males involved felt invulnerable. The rape girls felt defenceless, ignored and abandoned by those whose explicit job it is to protect them. And this obscenity was only made possible because non-English people wield the whip hand over the English. In April this year, a 19-year-old English girl called Chelsea Russell was found guilty of a racial hate crime after posting on Snapchat the unpleasant lyrics penned by an American gentleman of colour with the curious sobriquet of Mr. Snap Dogg Esquire, a man whose popular music career appears to be overwhelmingly based on using a certain word, albeit one ending with an A rather than an R, familiar to those of us who remember the name of Wing Commander Guy Gibson's dog. Ms. Russell had no ill intent. She was in fact an ardent admirer of Mr. Dogg, but Constable Dominique Walker, a hate crime unit operative within Merseyside Police, stated, "As a black woman I found the words offensive and upsetting. The words are offensive to both black and white people." Well, I'm not going to disagree with her on that, although this does seem to smack of racial double standards. As an Englishman, I rather doubt I could report a non-English person to the police for using the word cuffer, for example, which I personally find extremely offensive. I certainly wouldn't expect the police to take it seriously, nor the Crown Prosecution Service, and I would be flabbergasted that if they did, a judge would actually find the perpetrator guilty of a hate crime. If one is English, though, one can expect to be judicially treated with far greater severity than if one is non-English, which means we no longer have equality before the law in England, which means the non-English wield the whip hand over the English. I don't think Enoch Powell, even in his darkest moments, could have envisaged the extent to which the native English would become second-class citizens in their own land, and nor could he possibly have predicted the extent to which the British establishment itself would force the English people into their current situation. Britain's new hate crime laws are a case in point here, which list as protected classes a number of groupings such as race and religion, which of course encompass English Christians, but which then completely exclude English Christians as potential victims because they represent the oppressor group in Marxist dialectical terms, whilst all those of a non-English heritage remain the oppressed victims in perpetuity. And this leads to quite extraordinary situations, such as Muslim gang rapists never having to suffer additional sentencing for hate crime, despite telling the English girls they were white trash as they raped them. And the mainstream media gleefully report a surge in hate crime against Muslims, mostly name-calling on social media after an incident, such as the Manchester Ariana Grande concert bombing, which of course was not designated a hate crime, despite being the most hateful thing anyone could possibly carry out against a group of people based purely on their race and religion. And such bizarre racial double standards, such travesties of justice and morality are possible only because the non-English wield the whip hand over the English. And so the list goes on. Situation vacant. Applicant must be from an ethnic minority background only. This is positive discrimination, they tell us, but their positive is our negative. Whip hand. Multiculturalism celebrates all cultures as equal, they tell us, but our culture alone is responsible for the sins of empire, colonialism, slavery, inequality and oppression. Whip hand. English comedians of a left-wing bent, they're all bent that way, deride Christianity but remain mute about Islam because they fear, with good reason, Islam. Whip hand. The murder of Stephen Lawrence was abhorrent and evil, but so too was the torture and murder of Chris Donald by a Muslim gang in Scotland. One is a household name, the other is largely unknown. Whip hand. Non-English can never be guilty of racism. Marxist dialectic again, whilst all whites are knowingly racist or subconsciously racist. Whip hand. Black Police Association, Muslim Lawyers Association, yet no explicitly English association to be seen. Whip hand. National Union of Journalists guidelines command English hacks to ignore or downplay stories with violent non-English perpetrators committing crimes against the English, but to concomitantly shriek the headlines the other way around. Whip hand. And so the list goes on. Our defence is to speak the truth against this unprecedented assault on the English, but our freedom of speech is not simply under attack, it's gone. We're told this isn't so. We're told it is guaranteed under various laws and acts, but on the face of it is true, but our hate crime laws also mean anyone can take offence to anyone saying more or less anything, providing it's the English saying it, after which the Orwellian totalitarian hate crime laws can and are used to criminalise us. And the old adage of free speech being permissible as long as one did not shout fire in a crowded theatre has now been replaced by one which places the emotions or claimed emotions of the non-English above free speech itself and above the English people in general. What a truly surreal state of affairs. The English are not subordinate to the non-English because we lost a war. Rather, our subordination is forced upon us by our very own establishment, which has taken the side of the non-English because it feels it's the virtuous thing to do, or because it fears the consequences of telling racial religious truths. And as the native English demographic inexorably declines and the non-English demographic exponentially explodes, this situation will only worsen. Our beholden politicians represent the constituencies, of course, which in turn exert a disproportionate political influence due to the mass numbers of tiny constituencies in the cities where the non-English now reside, as opposed to the far larger rural constituencies where the English live. And as time goes by, our politicians will become ever more beholden to the non-English vote, until a point will come when the only possible way to win an election in a country brainwashed into identity politics is to promote a clearly anti-English manifesto. And anyone who thinks the Labour Party is already doing that ain't seen nothing yet. Our politicians, Conservatives included, are responsible for the wicked anti-English ethos prevalent within our schools, which reminds me of the real genuine consequence of their treacherous ideology. A few years ago, the BBC ran a typical bit of multi-culti agitprop when they interviewed 3 children about their racial religious heritage. The first, a Jamaican girl, beamingly told the Hackette how proud she was of her West Indian culture. The second girl, a Muslim, proudly proclaimed her Islamic background. The third, a little English boy, when asked where he came from, looked utterly bewildered. And after a baffled silence, he finally replied, "I don't know, I don't really come from anywhere." Whiphand, heartrending, tragedy, ongoing. Enoch, as they say, was right, but he was also wrong, or not quite in the way our Quisling class would bludgeon us into believing. He never imagined the monumental civilizational ending scale of mass immigration. He never imagined monocultural supremacist Islam would feature so heavily. And finally, he simply could not have imagined, because at that time it was truly unimaginable, the chilling extent to which the Quisling British establishment would facilitate the non-English whip wielder.
We will make America great again.